In 2018, America launched the biggest trade war since the Great Depression: tariffs, sanctions, blacklists. The weapons of economic warfare were fully deployed. 6 years later, the U.S. trade deficit with China still stood near $279 billion. American consumers paid an estimated $46 billion extra because of those tariffs. Nobody actually won that war, but somebody is definitely quietly losing ground. Two economies, two superpowers, one financial battlefield that never stops burning. If you want to understand where global money flows next, watch MacroHive Economy. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is only getting bigger. The rivalry between America and China is the defining economic story of this century. It shapes your prices, your job market, your savings, and your retirement portfolio. Let's start at the beginning, because context here is everything. After World War II, America built the global economic order from scratch. The dollar became the world's reserve currency under the Bretton Woods Agreement. American companies dominated manufacturing, finance, technology, and global trade. In 1980, China's entire GDP was smaller than the state of Texas alone. Few economists at that time predicted what was coming next for China. Then, Deng Xiaoping opened China's economy to foreign investment and market reforms. The results were nothing short of the greatest economic transformation ever recorded. China grew at an average of nearly 10% annually for almost 4 straight decades. That kind of sustained growth had simply never happened anywhere before in history. By 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and everything changed globally. American manufacturers suddenly faced competition from Chinese factories paying far lower wages. Between 2001 and 2011, the U.S. lost approximately 2.4 million manufacturing jobs directly. Economists David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson called this the China shock. Entire American communities built around factories were hollowed out within a single decade. The economic pain was real, concentrated, and politically explosive across the Midwest. Meanwhile, China was absorbing technology, building infrastructure, and expanding its industrial base. Foreign companies entering China were often required to share proprietary technology as entry payment. The U.S. trade deficit with China hit $419 billion by 2018, a staggering number. Washington argued this deficit was not just economics, it was structural systemic theft. In March 2018, President Trump signed an executive order imposing the first wave of tariffs. Solar panels, washing machines, then steel and aluminum all got hit with new levies. By July 2018, $34 billion worth of Chinese goods faced a flat 25% tariff. China retaliated immediately, targeting American soybeans, pork, and agricultural exports directly. Soybean farmers saw China's share of their exports collapse from 62% to just 18%. American farm losses from Chinese retaliation reached an estimated $24 billion in exports alone. The administration responded with farm bailout payments exceeding $28 billion over 2 years. In total, the U.S. imposed tariffs on over $550 billion worth of Chinese products. China retaliated with tariffs covering more than $185 billion of American goods in response. Both sides were bleeding, but neither side was willing to acknowledge the damage publicly. By August 2019, average U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods had risen from 3.1% to 24.3%. That's nearly an 8-fold increase in just 18 months of escalating economic conflict. American companies primarily absorbed those tariff costs rather than fully passing them to consumers. Profit margins were squeezed, capital investment was deferred, and hiring plans were shelved. The Tax Foundation estimated these tariffs reduced long-run U.S. GDP by 0.2% permanently. That translates to roughly $142,000 full-time equivalent jobs permanently removed from the economy. And yet, the trade deficit with China barely moved in the direction Washington wanted. A January 2024 study by economist David Autor confirmed the tariffs created 0 net jobs. The retaliatory tariffs, however, clearly had negative employment impacts, especially in American agriculture. The promises made to factory workers and farmers simply never materialized the way intended. A Phase 1 trade deal was signed in January 2020 with considerable ceremony in Washington. China committed to purchasing an additional $200 billion in American goods over 2 years. It also pledged to protect intellectual property and stop coercive technology transfer practices. China never came close to meeting those purchasing commitments. The shortfall was enormous. The pandemic arrived and reshaped global supply chains in ways nobody had fully anticipated. Both nations used COVID-19 as cover for actions that deepened economic separation even further. The Biden administration kept every single Trump tariff in place without a single rollback. In May 2024, Biden added new tariffs, 100% on Chinese electric vehicles specifically. Solar cells faced 50% tariffs, and semiconductor levies were also dramatically increased under Biden. The economic decoupling narrative was now fully bipartisan. no longer just one party's position. Then came 2025, and the second Trump administration escalated everything to historic levels. By early May 2025, average U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports had reached 127.2% peak levels. China's average retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods hit 125% across virtually all product categories. The Peterson Institute called this the most significant bilateral tariff escalation in modern economic history. U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports were now more than 15 times higher than in 2018. The financial markets convulsed, volatility spiked, supply chains were thrown into immediate disarray. After emergency talks in Geneva, both sides agreed to temporary reductions back to 10%. But the structural damage to trust, supply chains, and business confidence was already deeply embedded. American companies had spent years quietly building supplier relationships in Vietnam, India, and Mexico. The era of cheap, uncomplicated Chinese manufacturing for American markets was definitively ending. The trade war was just the surface layer of a much deeper economic fracture forming. Underneath the tariff headlines, both economies were quietly accumulating dangerous structural problems. And those problems tell very different stories depending on which economy you examine first. Start with China, because what is happening there is genuinely misunderstood by most people. For decades, China's real estate sector was its economic engine and its wealth storage system. At its peak, property and related industries contributed nearly 25% of total Chinese GDP. Chinese households put roughly 70% of their net worth directly into real estate assets. Then, in 2021, Beijing deliberately punctured the property bubble by restricting developer borrowing. The largest developer in the world, Evergrande, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. More than 60 Chinese developers have since defaulted on offshore debt or entered restructuring. Between 2024 and 2025, investment in real estate development fell by over 10% annually. Housing investment dropped from 12.3% of GDP in 2020 down to just 6.1% by 2025. Construction activity fell nearly 40% below its 2021 peak. Those numbers are extraordinary. Chinese households that prepaid for apartments years ago are still waiting for delivery today. Consumer confidence collapsed and never fully recovered, even after multiple government stimulus attempts. Dallas Federal Reserve researchers found 40% of bank loans to real estate became zombie loans. Borrowers cannot cover interest payments, yet banks roll loans over rather than recognize losses. The share of zombie firms across China's broader economy reached 16% in 2024. Local governments, which depended on land sales for revenue, found their finances gutted completely. Beijing committed $1.4 trillion in refinancing, just to prevent local government debt from imploding. Meanwhile, official growth data claimed China hit nearly 5% GDP growth in both years. Independent economists at Rhodium Group estimated actual growth at just 2.4% to 2.8% in 2024. History contains no example of a 5% growing economy experiencing 10 consecutive quarters of deflation. China's producer price index contracted for over 32 consecutive months through mid-2025, relentlessly. Falling factory prices, falling home prices, falling consumer confidence, all simultaneously collapsing inward. The IMF recommended monetary easing, yet actual borrowing rates barely moved throughout 2025. Beijing responded by expanding its fiscal deficit target to 4% of GDP for the first time. Total government deficit, including off-budget items, likely reached approximately 9% of GDP in 2025. Local government off-budget debt from financing vehicles was estimated at 46% of GDP alone. This is not just a property crisis. It is a crisis of economic confidence in capital. China's response to collapsing domestic demand was predictable and enormously consequential for everyone else. It leaned harder into exports, flooding global markets with cheaper, competitively priced goods. China's total trade surplus reached nearly $1 trillion in 2024, a world record figure. By November 2025, that record had already been surpassed, with weeks still remaining in the year. Export volumes grew 10%, while export prices fell for a third consecutive year running. Cheap Chinese goods were beneficial for consumers globally, but devastating for competing industries everywhere. European car makers, Southeast Asian manufacturers, and American factories all faced intensifying Chinese competition. The EU imposed its own tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, up to 45% in total. Brazil, India, and Mexico all launched anti-dumping investigations against Chinese imports during 2024 and 2025. China was exporting its deflation problem directly into every economy willing to accept its goods. Now shift across the Pacific and examine what America's own economic foundation actually looks like. The U.S. nominal GDP stood at approximately $29.2 trillion heading into 2025. Still number one, but beneath that headline number sits a debt problem of genuinely historic proportions and scale. U.S. national debt crossed $36 trillion in early 2025 and kept accelerating from that point. Interest payments on that debt became the federal government's single fastest growing expenditure category. Debt service costs now consume more of the federal budget annually than defense spending does. The dollar index fell roughly 11% in the first half of 2025, the biggest drop since 1973. Morgan Stanley projected the dollar could lose another 10% of its value through end of 2026. The Congressional Budget Office projects large deficits continuing for the entire next decade at minimum. Markets have tolerated American debt because Treasury bonds remain the deepest liquid sovereign market globally. But tolerance is not confidence, and that distinction matters enormously for financial stability ahead. The US dollar still represented about 56.7% of global foreign exchange reserves at end of 2025. That sounds dominant, until you realize it was over 70% as recently as the year 2000. The decline has been slow, steady, and so far largely ignored by American policymakers entirely. Russia and China now settle approximately 90% of their bilateral trade entirely in non-dollar currencies. China settles roughly half of all its foreign trade in yuan, up from just 20% in 2022. China's cross-border interbank payment system now has 1,167 indirect participants across 119 different countries. That system is still smaller than SWIFT, but its expansion trajectory is impossible to dismiss. BRICS. Central bankers in a 2025 survey said 73% believed dollar dominance would shrink by 2030. That is not a prediction from the fringe. Those are sitting central bankers making official statements. The critical question is not whether the dollar collapses tomorrow. It almost certainly will not. The real question is whether America can afford to ignore these structural signals for much longer. There is a genuine trap forming inside the American debt structure that few people discuss openly. If interest rates stay high, debt service costs compound, and the deficit grows even faster. If rates are cut to relieve pressure, the dollar weakens further and inflation potentially returns. If government spending is cut to slow the debt, economic growth contracts, and tax revenues fall, every exit from that trap creates a new and equally serious problem somewhere else in the system. China faces its own version of this same structural trap, just packaged in different specific details. Both nations are simultaneously powerful and vulnerable in ways that their headlines never fully capture. That contradiction, power and fragility coexisting, is the defining economic paradox of this entire era. The technology war between America and China is where this rivalry gets truly dangerous, because whoever controls the next generation of computing controls the next century of wealth. Semiconductors are the oil of the 21st century, and both nations understand that completely. Taiwan currently produces over 90% of the world's most advanced chips on the planet. A single company, TSMC, sits at the center of the global technology supply chain. America produces only 12% of global chip output, and none at the most advanced nodes. That dependency exposes the United States to a vulnerability that no tariff can easily fix. The U.S. CHIPS Act of 2022 committed over $52 billion to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing. By late 2024, the Commerce Department had agreed to more than $30 billion in awards, but building advanced chip factories takes years. The supply chain gap exists right now today. China recognized this vulnerability early and acted with enormous state-directed financial force. Beijing's National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, called the Big Fund, directed $95 billion. The third round of that fund alone added $48 billion in May 2024, a single commitment. Chinese manufacturers spent over $26 billion in 2024 just on legacy chip manufacturing equipment. China already dominates global production of legacy chips, those used in cars and appliances. By 2025, Chinese domestic AI chips held nearly 41% of China's own internal AI chip market. Before 2023, NVIDIA controlled over 90% of that same market. The reversal is extraordinary. Huawei's Ascend series is closing the performance gap, though still behind NVIDIA's most advanced chips. American AI giants, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, plan to spend $650 billion on AI in 2026. The chip export war became a tangled, self-contradictory policy mess throughout 2024 and 2025. Biden banned advanced AI chip sales to China, costing NVIDIA billions in lost revenue immediately. Trump reversed parts of that ban, then reimposed restrictions, then reversed again, whiplash policy. NVIDIA took a $4.5 billion charge in early 2025 from one single H20 chip export ban. China retaliated by banning its companies from buying those same chips in September 2025. Beijing ordered data centers less than 30% complete to remove all installed foreign chips entirely. The US then banned NVIDIA's next downgraded chip model in November 2025, escalating again further. Each restriction pushes China harder and faster toward complete semiconductor self-sufficiency permanently. Goldman Sachs concluded, America has maintained a lead in frontier AI research and platform capabilities, but China is rapidly closing the gap in practical deployment. Robots, drones, and autonomous vehicles. China is now building the equivalent of the entire US power grid every 4 years in clean energy. In 2025 alone, China added over 540 gigawatts of new power capacity, 80% renewable energy. America's AI data centers will need to more than double their electricity consumption by 2030. China's ability to rapidly build and connect power generation gives it a real infrastructure advantage. That energy edge could become a decisive factor in the AI race within this coming decade. Meanwhile, China controls 80% of rare earth processing, materials essential for advanced technology manufacturing. The US produces rare earth ore domestically, but exports 80% to China for processing anyway. China has already weaponized these rare earth restrictions in direct response to American chip controls. Analysts warned a severe rare earth restriction could cause a 1% US GDP slowdown alone. This is how deeply the two economies remain entangled, even as both sides sprint toward separation. The decoupling narrative is real, but the timeline is being consistently underestimated by most observers. China's trade surplus as a share of its exports grew from 15% in 2019 to 30% by 2025. Despite US tariffs, China's total global exports continued growing. It simply redirected them elsewhere. Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia have absorbed enormous rerouted Chinese manufacturing and trade flow. America imposed a 40% transshipment penalty specifically to block that China through third country workaround route. The world is not splitting cleanly into two separate blocks. It is fragmenting into complicated, overlapping dependencies. Countries like India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia want access to both American and Chinese technology simultaneously. They are not choosing sides. They are leveraging both superpowers for maximum national economic benefit. This creates a paradox where decoupling is announced loudly while economic entanglement quietly deepens underneath. A full, hard decoupling between the US and China would cost the global economy trillions in disruption. So where does all of this leave the ordinary investor, business owner, and everyday working person? The answer is uncomfortable. In a world of permanently higher prices and permanently higher uncertainty, supply chain diversification is expensive. Those costs ultimately land on consumers across every market. Rebuilding semiconductor manufacturing domestically takes a decade and costs multiples more than importing from Asia. Every tariff paid by an American importer eventually reaches the end consumer in some form. Every Chinese deflation export puts downward pressure on wages in competing manufacturing economies globally. The IMF estimates a complete US-China economic split would reduce global GDP by 7% permanently. That is roughly $7 trillion in annual global wealth, permanently gone from the world economy. No country on earth escapes the consequences of what happens between Washington and Beijing economically. Not Europe, not Southeast Asia, not the Gulf states, not any emerging market anywhere on the planet. The most honest assessment of this rivalry is that neither side can afford to fully win. A collapsing China creates a global deflationary shock that immediately devastates American corporate earnings. A collapsing dollar destroys the financial architecture that has underpinned global stability for 80 years. Both nations need the other to remain stable enough to keep buying, selling, and financing globally. That mutual need for stability is the invisible guardrail that has prevented catastrophe so far. But guardrails only hold when both drivers respect that they exist in the first place. The decisions made in Washington and Beijing over the next 5 years will be genuinely historic. They will determine who leads the AI economy, who controls critical supply chains, and who finances whom. Understanding this rivalry, deeply, clearly, and with real numbers, is not optional for financial survival anymore. If this breakdown gave you real clarity on the world's most consequential economic story, subscribe now. Hit subscribe, drop a comment below, tell MacroHive Economy what topic you want broken down next. Your support keeps this analysis independent, fact-based, and free from the noise everywhere else.